Welcome back, Focus learners. Today on The Explainer, we're taking a look at one of the absolute giants of the 19th century, a guy who literally bridged the worlds of faith, science, and exploration. I'm talking about David Livingstone. Okay, let's dive into this. You know, when David Livingstone died, his body was shipped all the way back to Britain, but his heart remained buried in the African soil. And that is not just some poetic metaphor, it's literal historical fact. His companions actually buried his heart beneath a tree in Africa, simply because they knew it belonged to the continent he loved so deeply. It really just grabs you, right? It pulls you straight into the sprawling adventure of his life. But how exactly did a young boy from Scotland end up leaving his literal heart in Africa? Well, to understand how that happened, we need to go back to Chapter 1, Humble Beginnings. And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering, epic milestones of his life. We're looking at a journey spanning from his birth in 1813 all the way to his death in 1873. Along the way, we hit his arrival in Africa in 1841, his famously awe-inspiring encounter with Victoria Falls in 1855, and that legendary moment he was found by Stanley in 1871. But hey, before we get to the famous historical explorer, we really have to look closely at the boy. So he was born on March 19, 1813 in Blantyre, Scotland, and he was born into a very, very poor family. To put this in perspective, by the time he was just 10 years old, David was already working long, grueling hours in a cotton mill. But here is the fascinating part. Despite that sheer, bone-tiring exhaustion, he was relentlessly self-taught. He studied medicine, languages, the Bible, all completely on his own time. That kind of iron determination to educate himself, that became the defining characteristic that prepared him for the absolute brutal challenges he'd eventually face deep in the African interior. Actually, his whole mindset is perfectly summed up in his personal motto: fear God and work hard. It's incredibly concise, isn't it? But, this strict discipline was the exact fuel he needed for his incredible transformation from an impoverished mill worker into a historical icon. He actually later credited this relentless hard work as the ultimate preparation for everything that was to come. Which brings us to Section 2, the Call to Africa. This is where his grand adventure officially begins. You see, his journey wasn't just some accident. It was a highly deliberate, step-by-step process. First, as a young man, he became deeply committed to the Christian faith. He was so inspired by missionary reports that he made a firm, life-altering decision to serve overseas. Step 2, he formally studied medicine and theology. He firmly believed, and rightly so, that providing critical medical care would open the door for him to share the gospel with people who were really in need. Step 3, he joined the London Missionary Society, which naturally leads us to Step 4, his arrival in South Africa in 1841. Now, when he first arrived, he didn't just strike out into the vast wilderness on his own right away. He actually started out working alongside a veteran missionary named Robert Moffat. And, fun fact, he ended up marrying Robert's daughter, Mary. But Livingstone had this profoundly restless spirit. While most people might have been perfectly content to just stay within the relative safety of those established mission stations, Livingstone felt this absolutely undeniable calling to push way, way beyond them. He wanted to go into regions where Europeans had literally never gone before. And that takes us to Part 3, Mapping the Unknown. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this massive number staring right back at us: 29,000 miles. That is roughly 46,000 kilometers. That is the staggering distance Livingstone traveled during his lifetime across southern and central Africa. And keep in mind, we're not talking about taking a train or a jeep here. This was almost entirely on foot and by canoe. Just mind-blowing. So how on earth did he survive covering that kind of ground? Well, a big part of it was that he traveled extensively with local guides. Working together, they mapped rivers, lakes, and trade routes that were entirely unknown to Europeans at the time. And he wasn't just walking aimlessly, he was constantly, carefully documenting. He took meticulous scientific observations about the geography, the wildlife, local cultures, you name it. He effectively merged his deep faith with this profound scientific exploration, which just massively expanded European knowledge of the whole continent. And this brings us to a perfect example of his geographical discoveries. Back in 1855, he became the first known European to describe this spectacularly massive waterfall on the Zambezi River. You can clearly see the linguistic duality here. He famously named it Victoria Falls, after the British Queen. But of course, the local people already knew the falls by another, much older name. They called it Mosiotonia, which roughly translates to the smoke that thunders. It is such a striking name, right? It's still widely used today, and it just perfectly captures the immense, roaring power and the towering mist of those falls. Livingstone himself was completely captivated by it. He actually described it as one of the most beautiful sights he had ever laid eyes on. But his expeditions were about so much more than just documenting geography. Chapter 4: Fighting the Slave Trade. During those extensive travels, Livingstone witnessed firsthand the absolute sheer human suffering caused by slave traders operating in the region. Seeing these horrors turned him into a deeply passionate abolitionist. He developed a very clear strategy. He believed that opening up what he called legitimate trade alongside the spread of Christianity would actually provide a viable economic alternative to the brutal slave trade. By carefully and impartially documenting these terrible conditions, his vivid reports ended up totally awakening British public opinion. It provided a crucial, undeniable push to strengthen humanitarian reforms and help end the slave trade in East Africa. Which brings us to Section 5, Lost and Found. By the late 1860s, things take a very dramatic turn. Livingstone seemingly just vanishes into myth. For literally years, this was the question echoing around the entire world. Where is Dr. Livingstone? He had completely disappeared from public view while exploring deep in Central Africa. The suspense was incredibly intense, and honestly, a lot of people back in Europe genuinely feared he had perished in the jungle. But then, in 1871, we get the legendary historical payoff. A journalist named Henry Morton Stanley finally tracked him down, finding him in the town of Ujiji. And as the legend goes, Stanley greeted him with what is now one of the most famous lines in exploration history: "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." It's just this incredible moment of relief and discovery that completely captured the world's imagination. Now, even though Stanley strongly urged Livingstone to return home to Britain with him, Livingstone point-blank refused. That leads us into Section 6, A Lasting Legacy. David Livingstone passed away on May 1st, 1873, in what is now modern-day Zambia, at the age of 60. And this actually brings us right back full circle to the very first slide we looked at today. His African companions were so intensely loyal to him that they actually carried his embalmed body for hundreds of miles, all the way to the coast, just so he could be returned to Britain. And, as we know, they buried his heart right there beneath that tree in Africa. So, the crucial point is, how do we even summarize a life this massive? Well, it comes down to a really multifaceted legacy. He explored vast, previously unmapped regions of southern and central Africa. He uniquely combined his missionary work with practical medicine and rigorous scientific discovery. He stood firmly and impartially in opposition to the African slave trade, advocating for critical humanitarian reform. And through his sheer endurance, he inspired generations of future explorers. He left us with so many insights, but perhaps none are better than his own unyielding words: "I will go anywhere, provided it be forward." I mean, wow, it completely encapsulates his extraordinary, adventurous spirit. For him, it was never about comfort or staying safe. It was always absolutely about progress. Which leaves us with this final provocative question to think about. How does Livingstone's philosophy of going anywhere, provided it be forward, apply to modern humanitarian efforts today? When we look at global challenges now, does that same relentless drive for progress and compassion still hold the key? It is definitely something for you to think about as you continue exploring history. Thank you so much for diving into the incredible life of David Livingstone with me today on The Explainer. Keep learning, keep pushing forward, and I'll catch you next time.